Welcome in, everybody, to this episode of Discard for Magic. As always, I'm your host, Aaron.
And I'm the other host, James, or Jexic.
And today we have with us a two-time tournament champion and faction expert, Prophet.
Hey, how's it going?
So, Prophet, why don't you start out and tell us just like a little bit of how you came to Summoner Wars? Because you didn't play first edition, right?
No, I did not. So I first learned about Summoner Wars when I think it was around COVID time, so 2020, and I had started picking up board gaming because, back during that period, that was just basically your only get-togethers. It's just these smaller gatherings, and I felt like board gaming kind of helped pass the time. And so when I got into it, I was watching reviews from Shut Up, Sit Down. They are these two European board game reviewers who were really critical, but also gave really good perspective on whether or not you would like a board game. And one of the reviews they did was on Summoner Wars, the second edition. And what really piqued my interest was that it was a combination of a card game, but on a board, which is probably the first I've ever seen it. And so, what really me to it outside of the artwork was sort of the seller review that the reviewers gave on the game. They basically had very little to no critiques about the game itself. And I think the toughest thing they said about the game was that eventually your skill gap with one another might make it less enjoyable for you to play it since it is a two-player game. So never played first edition, but always heard about it.
I feel like critique is fairly valid, as we've kind of found, just that there's definitely skill gaps that arise and make it hard to find good matches with people that you might just meet, Um,
I think that's very true. Did you ever watch their first edition review? Did you ever seek that
uh,
out?
I felt like I did. Oh man, I can't remember. I felt like it was a much older video.
Very old,
Um,
yeah.
yeah, it was like they've changed a lot, and I didn't even know these guys have been reviewing games for so long. But I think I started watching a bit of it, but I don't think I got through the video. I probably got distracted. But interestingly enough, so I travel to Boston from time to time to visit my girlfriend, and we actually went to a local board game store, and this was when I was in the I don't want to say my prime, not my prime, but I was obsessed with Summoner Wars. And so we paid the entrance fee. I think they charge by either the hour or just the daily pass. And so one of the first games that I saw was Summoner Wars, but the first edition one. And I was like, well, there's never a better time to try this out. And so she was one of the first people to ever play the second edition with me, and so she knew the rules, and they really aren't that different in first edition. So we pulled out the box. I mean, we brushed up on maybe some minor differences, and then we just started playing. I think she was playing the cloaks, and I was what is that? The shadow elves. There we go. Um, so they were very different, and the artwork, a lot of the mechanics, it was familiar, but not quite, you know. And so I did like the kind of what the theme was going for, but I can tell kind of how much the second edition has fundamentally improved the formula and kind of streamlined the action. So I did have a little bit experience playing 1E in that sense, but it came after playing the second edition. So
one of the few people who could say that, probably.
Yeah.
yeah.
When you played second edition, did you instantly like love it, or did it take you a while to fall in love with it?
Oh, I absolutely fell in love with it like immediately. I think so one of my best friends in real life, the one who drew we were talking about it earlier, the one who drew my profile picture, he's the one I board game with pretty much constantly. And so I picked up this game. I said, "Hey, you gotta try this out. It's like Magic the Gathering but chess." And we picked up the decks. My first deck was Fallen Kingdom. His was Vanguards. It felt like a very classic matchup, and immediately fell in love with it. Like we wanted to try all the decks, try different matches, and we played through the night, and we didn't even really know that there was an online app or community at all, right? Like this is to us just another board game we would play. Um, it wasn't until we did some more research because we're like, man, there's got to be like somebody out there because this is the second edition that has like done videos or put out some content. And to my surprise, there wasn't too much. Um, felt like we saw a couple of maybe videos from content creators, but it didn't feel like there was all too many resources out there, and so I ended up stumbling upon the League or Summoner Warzone, and from there I was like, well, there is an entire community that plays competitively. I've got to get into this, and so that's kind of how I started. But yeah, back to the question. Immediately fell in love with it. I wanted to do nothing but play it all the time, and I think it being online and asynchronous just kind of made that addiction so much more possible.
Like I definitely feel like you've specialized in certain factions. I remember one of the first times I played against you, you kept playing Sky Spear Avians when they came out. Do you usually pick one to kind of focus on when a new pair comes out, or do you like to try them both?
So I do like to try them both. I think generally I lean towards one more than the other, and so whenever a pair of factions come out, I'll play like a couple of introductory games with them. But like with every release, I tend to just like one more than the other. Um, and it's I guess a part of me just really wants to like master the deck, and so I'll play it constantly over and over again. Maybe there's a mechanic of the deck that gives me an itch I just really want to scratch. I think with the Sky Spear Avians, the flight mechanic was just really fun and fluid, and sort of solve that kind of puzzle solving itch I wanted to scratch all the time, and so yeah, I tend to focus on one deck at a time. I think that kind of goes against being competitive at times because what ends up happening is I play that deck throughout the entire release. So when Fungal Dwarves and Eternal Council was released, I only played Fungal Dwarves. I played maybe 2 Eternal Council games total. So like whenever I play someone who goes as Eternal Council, I just have no idea what they're gonna do. I know your cards, but like I'm just hoping I don't die every turn. So
Yeah, I'm on the other side of that one. I play more Eternal Council these days, but even then, I kind of skipped that release. I was real busy at work, and then came back when Brub was released. But
And I've never played Fungal Dwarves ever, so I don't know either of those factions really. I mean,
yeah, same thing with Sand Goblins and Obsidian Dwarves. I've played like maybe 2 or 3 OD games, but Sand Goblins was just my cup of tea, and so ended up just playing that faction to death. And I think that's just like a habit I've built now. Because I think with this most recent release, I've only played High Elves. I rarely touch Swamp Orcs, so um, I tell myself I'll get around to it, but I just never do, and so I yeah.
so recently the deck building tournament finished, but also the base deck tournament finished fairly recently. And you only pick so many factions to take in these tournaments. How'd you choose from these factions which ones to pick? And did you have any regrets with the ones you picked?
Yeah. So generally there are maybe 1 or 2 core factions that I'm very comfortable with. I feel have a lot of good matchups, and generally I feel like these are good competitive factions. Now which 1 or 2 factions these are kind of depends on what's, I don't want to say meta, but what's meta at the moment. But I generally stick to a core group of factions I'm comfortable with. So like in this most recent tournament, I would say Sand Goblins, Fungal Dwarves. I played these factions the most. I feel pretty good about bringing them to a tournament. And then even before that, I've always felt very comfortable, and I felt like cloaks were pretty competitive. And so, in just about every tournament, I'd have a core group of factions. Um, it really depends because I think like it wasn't until like the last 2 or 3 tournaments that we really stuck to the 4 faction format. But whether there's one or two extra, I've started to kind of challenge myself to bring one of the release actions for that tournament. So in this most recent one, it was High Elves. I didn't do it in the prior one, but generally, when Cloaks was released, Fungal Doors were released, I would just pick one of the factions that were being released, and I'd take them. Um, I think it's interesting because your lack of experience with that faction is kind of compensated by the fact that other people haven't really faced them all too much, and so I think you probably stand better because of that, because you probably are playing this faction over and over again, and not many people have a good understanding of how their specific. Let's say you take, I don't know, High Elves, and someone brings Polar Dwarfs. They might not know how to use their faction to kind of counter High Elves or whatever, right? So
Yeah, I'd say in the final, like Water D definitely said that that was the one that he was most disadvantaged in because he hadn't gotten the reps in against high elves. So that makes sense.
yeah, yeah, and even though High Elves is, I would say, on the more complex side, you probably are baffling your opponent a lot more than you're baffling yourself, and so I think you do stand to gain something. So I think we're starting to see releases for two of the newer factions, like Mountain Vargath and the Crimson Order, right? So very likely I pick one of them and take them to the tournament, even not really touching these decks all too much. So I feel like that's a fun thing to do, and then I'll just pick some of the other core factions I'm comfortable with and see how they turn out.
Do you have a inkling of which one you're gonna take, so everybody else can have a chance to beat you? Practice against that one.
So I am part of the playtesting server, and I do playtest, and I think from my experience, and I don't do it all too much because my schedule is busy, but I remember liking Mountain Vargath a bit more, so I'm leaning towards them. So it might be, you might see some goats.
I think I'll take them too. I'm not leaning towards them. I'm charging towards them.
Oh yeah, that's the right way to do it.
This might be my favorite release so far. I think I like both factions quite a bit.
Yeah, yeah. I think they bring some unique things to the table. So
I think it seems like the releases just keep getting better and tighter, which you wouldn't expect to be happening. It seems like you'd get to a situation where like they'd run out of ideas or it'd be harder to balance things, but it seems like things just keep getting better. So, and I don't mean it's better as in stronger, but just as better as in like the design. I don't know. It's just looking good.
yeah, no, I agree.
So in the tournament, you went 25-2. Which match did you think was your hardest? You only lost two of them.
Yeah, well, I guess so. One of those was from the final match, like the best 2 out of 3. I guess so my initial thought on this was the hardest match I had leading up to the finals was the one I lost, and I think it speaks for itself. But it's not quite. I mean, I felt like I had good opponents all around. The one I did lose, I was playing Fungal Dwarves, and I ended up facing Swamp Orcs. And it was a tough matchup for me because I think Muglug, their summoner, was able to just easily one shot my beast. And more importantly, being so summoner centric, Fungal Doors was really just lacking the fodder they needed to really grow their army. Um, Now, I also felt like the consistency of your draw really matters when you're playing a deck that ecosystem around it. I've had this discussion before, and I know RNG is going to be bad all around for every deck, but Jungle Doors, I feel like even though some of their ceiling is kind of exaggerated when you just see this massive mushroom grow on the board, they're really held back by the fact that if you don't get specific cards early on, your entire game plan will just fall apart. And so I think in that specific matchup, I struggled to make it work because I drew two of my epic events, the spore releases, and I had no spores. I had the starting one, but like it just felt so wasteful to only bring back one. And so I was getting greedy, and I felt like, my opponent was making all the right moves, and I just kept holding on to hope that I would draw into another spore carrier. I never did. And it wasn't until I decided to, bring back one, um, before it was just too late. And so I'd say that was probably one of my harder matches in the tournament, and I ended up losing because it was a mix of me not being realistic with myself and trying to squeeze value, and then I think my opponent just knew how to handle uh, my faction, and so I kind of struggled a bit there.
That's fair. Yeah, I saw your draw was pretty poor in that game for sure. You drew like both spores, demand, and a monstrosity all in the same turn, and that's
Yeah,
just it's rough to deal with as the fungal dwarves.
yeah, it was not great.
For the championship, you chose sand goblins, fungal dwarves, and high elves. Do they let you choose any factions you want? Do you choose just from the four that you take into the tournament? How's that work?
So this was an interesting one. I knew this from the prior tournament because it's the same exact format, and so basically the order that you pick your factions when entering is the order that they line you up for your final match. So the fourth faction is excluded, and then one, two, and three are matched up with your opponent's one, two, and three, unless there's a mirror match. And in this case, there wasn't any mirror match, but this was something I was debating when I was signing up for the tournament. It's not only which factions would I take, it's which factions would I take to the finals.
And in which
Um,
order?
which order, right? So you're kind of metagaming a little bit here, and trying to think, okay, do I bring my strongest faction first and go against someone else's strongest faction, or maybe I throw my weakest faction, call it a wash. And so it's kind of a little bit of strategy to that, but also really, really hard to do because you have no idea who your opponent's going to be and what their factions would be. So I just kept it simple. I picked what I thought would be my best faction. So I picked Sand Goblins to go as my number one. And then I had to choose between Fungal Doors, High Elves, and Cloaks, which one I wouldn't want. And I don't know. I felt like High Elves were really strong at the time. I had a hunch. I never really took them to any competitive scene, but when I was playing my public games with them, I was like, man, these guys they have a lot of tools. They have a lot of flexibility, and these are things I like because I feel like no matter what you're matched against, you have options. So I ended up not taking cloaks. Um, Slightly regretted it, but I think it worked out in the end. I think when I first saw the matchup with Water D and I was my Fungal Dwarves against his Savannah Elves, I was like, man, that's a poor matchup for Fungal Dwarves. And then I looked at his other picks, which were Breakers and Polar Dwarves. And I was like, well, the only matchup I would like as Fungal Dwarves is maybe Polar Dwarves. And I'm just, I feel like Fungal Dwarves, they are starting to get figured out by people. And so there's just a lot of answers that are now coming, and people are like, okay, I know how to deal with them. I know what cards to keep, what not to. Um,
Breakers probably would have been worse, right, for fungal dwarves?
Yeah,
yeah.
about the same probably, but not better.
Yeah, no, I had a tough game with Massimo last tournament where
Massimo's breakers are
he
so hard.
yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, just having all your units next to you is just a liability to get mind captured, mind controlled, and blasted through. And so, um, yes, yeah. Back to your question, you do get to pick which factions you take to the championship, but you have to do it as you sign up.
But yeah, it worked out. If for anyone who hasn't watched those games, they're really exciting, especially the Fungal Dwarves versus Savannah Elves one. Everyone on stream was really hyped for that
Oh, it's
game.
insane.
Yeah, yeah. That my jaw dropped. I was watching the last roll and I was like, oh my god, it's happening. uh,
I mean, I guess I could just summarize, but basically there was like an average roll throughout the turn, but the way that it came out was very exciting.
I mean, we can talk about it. I think anybody who hasn't seen it yet can go back and watch it still. But
Like he had a Linus get up there and roll 8 dice and get 8 out of 8 on a 9 health Koldak. And then he had he had 2 dice to win it and went 0 for 2.
just brutal.
But on average, 8 out of 10 melee is average, but getting it in that order made it really
I know.
like.
And in these moments where they're going for lethal, and it's like something you kind of expected. So I knew he had entangle. I thought he would come the other way, so I dropped a gate. But then he like walked 8 spaces the other way, and I was like, oh god, here comes pain. And you see the 8 for 8, and you're at 1 health. In that like split second, you're like, ha, what if you go 0 for 2 right now? I would just and then
Yeah, that
and
would have
it
knocked you
happened.
out too. Yeah.
I was like that, and that exact thing happened, and I was able to follow it up, and I was like, wow. I messaged him immediately after because I was still in disbelief. And I said, what are the odds? And actually, we did talk about the odds a little bit. I was like, yeah, this is kind of as expected, but just the way that it shook out is, I said, man, you guys are gonna love it. They're gonna love it on the stream.
Yeah, crazy ending.
Yeah, and then the third game was a bit of a blowout with your high elves.
Yeah, no, that one I felt pretty good about. And it was, you play these games simultaneously, so you kind of have a feel for games you're winning, games you're losing. I felt like Fan Goblins versus Breakers was just that game was getting away from me over time, and I didn't feel great about my odds, but I didn't feel like I was quite out. Fungal Doors, I just felt it felt kind of hopeless towards the middle slash end. I think there was a role in there where I basically had to kill one of my own carriers, not even infected, just kill it, so that I could get the boost and pop 2 carriers. I missed. And so, in order for me to not just have 2 carriers that are 2 boosted right next to me that I would just lose, I ended up just demanding my own carrier and killing nothing, just so that it could die. So I also felt pretty bad about that game, but whenever I flipped over to the Polar Dwarfs High Elves games, I was like, okay, well, at least I'm not just going to get, completely rolled. And so I felt pretty good about that game. I think there was a moment where Water D kind of had me a little bit nervous. I It was right around the time I think Colby it spoiled the ending, but essentially I was pushing up with Valeria, had Sanctity going up, felt pretty good. Then he trapped me with an ice ram. And so I had to be very careful walking back, making sure there's no way he kills me because I felt like I had a good advantage. But you'll see it if you watch the games. They're pretty good.
So speaking of high elves, you're probably the resident expert on them in the community. What would you say their strengths are currently?
Crazy enough, their strength is like in their versatility, and I mean I say this about a lot of factions, sand goblins, cloaks, but they do so in a way that like really allows you to play a lot of different types of games. And from an economic perspective, I think they do a lot. I think peace is one of the strongest commons in the game, and its ability can really just make or break the tempo of a game, whether or not you have 1 or 2 units more on the board. And I feel like the amount of raw damage they can bring can really put your opponent on the back pedal. Um, I feel like Valeria is just one of the coolest summoners that has been released recently, and I know that Summoner Wars, has tended to evolve to more summoner focused decks. So like Buglug, Balzar, decks that just like to pump a lot of damage in their summoner to get them involved, and that's fun. But I feel like Valeria and High Elves, they do it in a way that is a little bit more strategic, still kind of retains that power. Um, so her ability to force an enemy or allied common one space in 2 different phases gives her a lot of positional and board flexibility that kind of makes it hard for your opponent to really prepare for. Um, Especially when you pair it with things like
The epic.
the epic, right? Like oblige or the one that gives all of your commons versatile, then now you have so many varying board states that it becomes really hard to kind of plan around. And so, most I would say most of my high elves games kind of starts out as I put out a lot of peace on the board. I'm backing them up with war so that they're trading at range and usually winning those trades because I mean, not many ranged units can take out a 3 health, basically 4 health unit in one turn. And so that usually forces your opponent to kind of think, okay, I got to start doing something. And if they make a mistake, they whiff or they position incorrectly, then you have liberty, you have war, you have oblige, you have so many ways to either trap them, damage them, or straight up assassinate them that it becomes kind of you're screwed if you do and you're screwed if you don't kind of situations. So I think what ends up happening in a lot of high elves games is like you and this is a good way to tackle them. You end up just charging at them because you're like, well, I'm not winning this trade, and they just have so many different tools that if on the offense it becomes almost impossible to kind of foresee and protect yourself against everything. That's a lot to say, but essentially, I think the summoner gives just so much value at nearly all stages of the game, and she can do so in different phases and do so with different strategies, such as like moving a unit to protect another unit, moving a blocker out of the way so you can chip away at their summoner. There's just so many things she can do that like really makes her so useful in any kind of game plan you decide you need to do to win the game.
Do you find most of your games like go long and run out of the deck, or are you often getting these kind of assassination wins earlier in the game?
I feel like I end up going for assassination more than I end up going for economy. The high elves don't really have a great way to take back a game once you've decked out. There's no recursion really. I mean, your best bet probably is Cassia, who can maybe just heal units to keep them alive. But if Valeria was going against Jungle Dwarves, Fallen Kingdom, even Sand Goblins, just decks that have some sort of natural recursion to them, I don't think she would win that game. So if I find like I'm not winning on economy, and this typically happens with like Fallen Kingdom, I generally try to start making my way towards the middle of the board, and you'd be surprised with her ability to force in both move and attack phase, how much reach the High Elves actually has. And especially when you start thinking about commons like the priest, who can just be spawned on top of any of the arbiters, um, that gives you incredible range, and it gives you a lot of power in your offense. And so I find that most of my victories end up being before I deck out, and I think that's the strategic decision I would make if I feel like I might not win the econ game, or I have a good shot at doing so.
Any units that you think are like must plays? Like, do you play all your priests or all your wars?
Um, so I mean, I think my must plays are probably almost all of my pieces. I think piece is probably essential in making sure your units are economically viable. Um, War, I think, on the other end is something that I pretty much discard almost always. I think I only keep about one or two, and that's just because they're not really frontline units. They might seem like it, but they're not, because the trade off that they give and your opponent's ability to kill them last makes it a very bad trade most of the time. Um, I try to play about two or three of my justices. They're kind of expensive, but I mean, a justice is just really good stat wise. I mean, for 2 cost, he comes out at 5/3, which is equivalent to the bear cavalry from Polar Dwarfs, right? So already he's looking pretty good stat wise. Now his ability to atone and him damaging himself kind of puts him on par with the curve. So like he goes to 4/3 if you attack with him. But the chances of him dying in one hit are usually pretty slim. So that one damage you deal to yourself is likely going to be something you give back to your opponent. And so when you consider that, he's still slightly above the curve. So I'd say Justice is probably one of your stronger economic units. And if you pair it with Peace, he is just a monster. I think Justice makes um, Albus more viable just because he essentially negates his ability on his own turn, and that just makes him not only from a stat wise cost efficient, but the fact that he can act like Finessa, where every time someone does not damage to him, just damage to anyone in general, he's serving this retribution in something that would be normally reserved for like a champion or divine retribution. And so I think he's more key than people would think. And I just played a Summoner Scuffle with Vexer, where he took Shadow Elves and I took High Elves. And one of the debates, I think not even debates, one of the discussions I think was something you brought up, Jexic, where you asked how should we think about High Elves when we're looking at Justice specifically because his
You're just be feeding them boosts potentially, yeah.
Oh yeah, and Vexer was definitely capitalizing on that. And something I didn't really know was that a Seeker would attack Justice, which would be and be in range out of range of Selundar's ability, then can feint back into range and then choose to take a tone when she's in range of Selundar's ability. So Seeker was
That's
just
funny.
bringing the boost back with her, and I was like, man, that's crazy. I thought I was out of your summoner's range, but you just, decided to resolve that in a way where you could capitalize on it. So, um, even then, I said it is your core unit, one of your core units. And I mean, there's a reason you start off with it too. They're the damage and the bulk you need to kind of keep your presence on the board.
But you probably then summon a lot of the priests too, just to heal them up periodically and get board position.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're getting value because your justice will always be injured from its first attack. Your justices are usually in the frontish lines, so you'll have great spots to summon them with. And then something I love doing with justice is just denying my opponent the magic by having him kill himself with his own ability. So if he's at 1 health, I would just retreat all my units behind a gate, have him kill himself, them no targets or magic. Or if I have Liberty up and I need 2 health for him to really dish out the damage, I might summon a priest on top of him, give him that 2 health, and then have him atone himself back to 0. So cool things you can do with him.
Leaving a justice on 1 health is like the worst feeling. I had a game where I had Edia left a justice on 1 health, like turn 1, and then they played loyalty and ran up with the justice and hit Edia for 4 damage. I was just and then died. I was just like, ah. So that's definitely a thing you can do, and just start chipping at the summoner with it or anything else. Just let your justice die on your turn, and it feels good. It's a good tip.
So you mentioned Albus, right? Do you think Albus is the strongest of the 3 champs? I know people like to play Cassie a lot. I feel like Titus is a trap.
Oh yeah, I'd have to agree with you here. I think Cassia is probably the strongest potential wise. Albus's strength lies within his cost efficiency. So at 3 magic, you're really not having to build for him a lot. I think, if you drew Cassia and Albus, I'd probably just keep Cassia. But, if your champions were spread evenly throughout the game, you honestly could play both and use them both pretty well. I think Cassia just can do some absolutely insane things in the game, especially if you're facing a deck that cannot output a lot of direct damage or just burst down your units in general. I think we talked about it over in the previous finals, but once I got Cassia out, I knew that Polar Dwarves, they didn't really have all too much burst potential, and so I could really kind of expect what kind of damage to be taken from my units. And so putting Cassia in the middle of your army, it makes them feel near invincible. I think she does a better job of healing than any other unit in the game, and can do so without any cost, which I think is key. On the other hand, I think Albus is a close second, and not just so that he could help get value out of Justice, but I think Albus can just help you reform your auras in a way that benefits you the most, not really have to worry about what your opponent is getting. And an example I like to think of is Peace, right? So Peace is probably the trickiest one to deal with because, you know, you're trying to put it in a position where it can do damage but not be exposed too much. But if your opponent decides to run up against Peace, then you're in this awkward situation where you can't not give it the buff, but now you can't eliminate it. Albus can just neutralize that specific piece or that specific unit, and it lets you basically, have your formation, and it's sort of like a backstop so that you can make mistakes with your formations and it not be too devastating on your end. And at 3 Magic, he's not too hard to play. So I feel like I try to get him out every game I can. But Cassia is definitely how I feel like you win the economic curve.
And then Titus, you haven't mentioned, so do you usually just discard him for Magic?
Pretty much. I've talked about this on the Discord, and I feel like I've been really, really trying to get him out in my games. I do see potential, but it's just really hard to justify the 6 Magic when you have so many great commons and other champions, and pretty much every other card in the deck I would rather have, 2 or 3 copies of than to get Titus up on the board and having that board wipe. Um, Having double greater engage uh, is kind of overkill. And I feel like, it's cool when you're shoving an opponent away and just instantly killing them, but then you have nothing to attack. Um, and usually you don't need it. So, and then the taunt is also not not bad, but like it just feels a little out of place in the deck for me, at least, because I feel like, you don't get the peace aura on your champions. You want them to hit things that have the peace aura. So I wouldn't know really when I would put him on the board outside of protecting Valyria. But then I ask myself, why would I need to be protecting Valyria if, I'm not, unless I make a mistake, right? Like I generally don't send Valyria out to just fight just cause. Um, I usually either start out when she has Sanctity or when, I am reasonably protected. But if I have Sanctity up on her, I don't want them hitting my champion. I want them hitting her. So it just never felt right for me to build, get it out on the board. And given all the other commons I kind of want to play, I never really had the magic. And so I generally discard him. Um, I haven't yet found a really strong use case for him. So
Their event suite. Do you generally discard some of those for Magic, or what do you play most often?
So I try to play all my Sanctities. I feel like Sanctity is definitely one of Valeria's signature events. I know Oblige is the epic. Um, Oblige to me is basically kill one of their commons. And generally that's what I use it for. But sometimes maybe I'll use it as like a sneaky assassination. So, I clear their blocker, then I'll oblige a unit in front of me and hit their summoner. Um, but I feel like Sanctity is really how you can really just take control of the game. Because Valeria herself as a summoner and a combat unit, she can pretty much take on your entire enemy's board. Her ability to move things out of the way or deal 2 automatic damage to them, and also make sure units just don't walk past her. She just does so much, and so I try to get Sanctity up when I feel like my board is close to getting wiped, or they have a lot of commons on the field that I could just send Valeria in and really force them to only do 1 damage at a time. Um, Another event that I've really been liking a lot is Liberty. I feel like giving all of your units versatile is where your damage comes from. Now, I know one of the key drawbacks of High Elves and something that really messes with a lot of players is that all of their events apply both ways. And so when I give a general, I guess, flavor of each of these events, you definitely have to evaluate the matchup, right? Um, Sanctity, for example, is actually worse when you're playing against Fallen Kingdom. And I learned that the hard way.
One life to summon, yeah.
One life to pull up units, and so that's just not worth it for me because like yeah, I'm up there doing cool things, but he's summoning undead warriors for 1 health. It's like insane, and you kind of have to weigh your options. So like Liberty, for example, I try not to, I definitely wouldn't play Liberty as much in a deck full of ranged units like Breakers, because Liberty is nuts on ranged cards. They can attack from pretty much everywhere, especially when your unit has on attack abilities like Wind Mage or Gunners, right? And so they're just doing completely crazy things that I figured I might as well just discard it for Magic and play a safer game at that point. But matchups aside, I think Liberty wins games. I think that if your opponent is, they're walking up, maybe they have a low health gate, or maybe you can summon a priest in a position where it can hit the summoner twice and be buffed by either loyalty or war. That's 6 dice, and that's really not hard to pull off. Your opponent, while they get the ability of it, they might not be positioned to do that. Maybe they're playing a deck that doesn't have great ranged commons. Maybe their gates aren't in the right spot. And maybe their summoner just took a lethal 2 or 3 hits that they have to spend one of their movements to put them in safety, and maybe another movement to block off any potential assassination. So they just can't reap the benefits because of that first move advantage. And I really think that's kind of how High Elves really takes the cake, is even though they give auras and they give events abilities to both sides, the ability to know when to play it and having that first mover advantage means that you can kind of predict what their response would be and understand when it's like most advantageous. So playing Liberty when you think they have to retreat as a response. Loyalty, I see myself discarding 1 copy of sometimes. I think it's good to have, but it's also really bad when your opponent can take advantage of it. I feel like there's not really all too many instances where I can bring units into their summoner's face, or I have ranged units next to Valeria to kind of capitalize on loyalty. So if I had to discard an event, usually it would be a loyalty. But that's probably how I would think about. And obviously, I think Oblige I played 2 of every time. I just think there's just so many things you can do with it that it's never not relevant. So
which matchups do you think are tougher for them, as far as the other factions, if they have any? You make them sound so powerful, but now it's like, but I'm sure that there's people out there struggling with them. So yeah.
No, they're not invincible. I don't think they have, they're strong against every faction. I think, for example, Fallen Kingdom is probably one of their tougher matchups, just because you can't play Sanctity. I don't really think you can assassinate as well because of how many units they are putting on the board with their resurrection. I think that Fallen Kingdom just has a much better econ game, and their units are already pretty strong comparatively. I mean, for example, if you think about the Justice interaction, like, an undead carrier at 2 health hitting a Justice, put him at 1, just so that he's easier to eat, actually works against you, right? So that they're just recurring that mechanic. Or maybe you can't stop Peace from giving auras to some of their zombies, making it much difficult for you to effectively clear them out. I think on that same note, probably Fungal Dwarves is probably on the tougher side. Sure, Valeria can go in and kind of shift their formations, but I feel like decks that have a very clear path to economic victory, it makes it tougher for High Elves. I think Sand Goblins probably has a slight edge against High Elves and probably Phoenix Elves. And I say that because they both have very consistent automatic damage, which is kind of very devastating for any sort of peace formations. Phoenix Elves, I played a match or 2, and I realized how difficult it was to not be able to move a unit next to Maldaria. I guess this is more of her like updated ability, but I've there's a lot of times where I'm like, I can't I can't move any unit to damage them. And so that kind of just takes away from my whole game plan. And then their automatic damage is just tearing apart my piece. And so I really find like I have very little options to work with when I'm facing those decks. Um, and then Shadow Elves, I feel like they can really abuse Justice a lot. So makes it a lot more difficult for me to put out one of my biggest damage dealers. And then they could also easily assassinate Valeria with some of their basic assassination attempts. And they also have very good recursion and economic methods. And so when we talked about it a little bit earlier, High Elves don't have recursion. They don't have a way to win once your deck is out. They just, just have to hope for an assassination at that point. And so Lundar can just stay in the back and do his thing. There's really not much you can do about it. So just throwing out a handful of factions there, I feel like the game is pretty balanced, right? I feel like there's no unwinnable matchup. You just have to figure out what cards you need to keep around and search for, and what is like the right moment to play it in order to win. So I definitely don't think they're unbeatable, but if you don't really know how to tackle them, it's going to feel very overwhelming for sure.
So if someone's learning High Elves and they want to play against some easier matchups, what do you recommend?
I think some of my better matchups as High Elves, probably like the Polar Dwarf matchup. I played it even before the finals, and that's mainly because that deck doesn't really have a lot of damage potential, and that really just serves to Valeria's like benefit. Ice Ram also recently got nerfed, so sending Valeria in to charge and completely wreck their board with Sanctity, you don't really have to be afraid of a crazy assassination because you get bounced around, right? I think decks that generally don't put out a lot of damage are probably going to be easier for High Elves. I've played a couple of Cave Goblin matchups, and honestly, I felt pretty good about them. I think Justice is just completely devastating for low health units.
Especially like slingers. I've played the Cave Goblin matchup or as the Cave Goblins, and I was like, this feels horrible because you have so many 2-life guys that can just get shoved around by Valeria, and then if you have a slinger near Justice, you just like die, and like you have to like attack a piece with the slinger and hope you get no hits just to get that first hit on the piece, and then do other weird stuff. It's weird.
Yeah, no, for sure. And it's like you're like Cave Goblins are very, very common heavy, and so Valeria just can punish that. Sanctity helps the Enrage the Horde turns and Pylon turns, but given how many extra attacks they have, it kind of helps offset that a little bit. But even then, I feel like High Elves kind of has a little bit of an advantage there. There's still a lot of matchups I haven't played. Like I don't think I've done High Elves versus Wayfarers or done it against Savannah Elves. That one's an interesting one because Justice kind of counters Border Archer, but Border Archer counters Peace, so it's like a little weird like love triangle there. But yeah, no, I'd say those are probably some of my easier matches from a High Elves perspective.
So you did a massive guide for fungal dwarves. Do we think there's one coming or in the works for High Elves? Is that something that you're looking at doing?
No, I've thought about this because when I was playing it, I think I would frequent the Discord a lot and kind of when people talk about High Elves, I'd be super interested. Not necessarily because I just want to go there and like impart wisdom or anything. I'm curious to see how other people were handling it because I always like to see how people play them just in case I might be missing something. So I've thought about it. So right now, I'm actually in progress, in the process of writing the Sand Goblins Advanced Guide, and that one I started a while ago, and community will have to forgive how long I'm taking because I think there's just a lot of life events that happen in the middle of that. Needless to say, I have the draft done, right? Like I've written out most of the content. But similar to what I did for Fungal Doors, I really, really like showing board state examples and kind of annotating that way. So that's kind of what stage I'm on with Sand Goblins. And I feel like that just really does a lot for a guide to kind of be able to reference board state when you're looking at just a bunch of text. So I wouldn't be opposed to writing the High Elves ones. I actually was very interested in kind of putting my thoughts down together as I learn a faction and kind of writing it, especially for guides, especially for factions that I think are just the more complex side, right? Like things that I think people should really try to consider to kind of make it less daunting for them. Not necessarily a beginner's guide, but just something that I feel like you can take that faction to a competitive level. Um, so at the moment, I haven't really started or had any plans to do it, but it would be the next faction I try to tackle after I finish the Sand Goblins guide.
So you're also involved in like a lot of community events in the Discord. You've been in a lot of tournaments and events that are put on by different members of the community, from like Red Debray's deck building league, the normal league, Shibata's tournaments, the Tournament of Champions. What do you like about these, and why do you like join all of them? Basically,
I have a problem. That's my so I mean, outside of just being obsessed with the game, I think these community run events, they all offer something like slightly different. And it's very interesting to me how you could take the same game and cut it and slice it in different ways, to make it just like a slightly different experience. I guess I'll start with like the Chibata tournaments, right? So these are custom fan made, fan run tournaments that offer different divisions or brackets, as you call it. And I think my initial appeal to it was the only tournament where you could play custom deck building. That's one. And then two, it's the only tournament that offers a team kind of perspective to it. And so um, those two things kind of drew me to these tournaments because I was like, wow, it'd be cool to kind of like cooperate with other people on a team. And then the other end of that, like I was very interested in deck building. I come from deck building card games that are standard to like TCG and like Magic the Gathering, Yu-Gi-Oh! And so it's always been something that's appealed to me. Um, but I never really found a good, I guess, place to kind of compete with it. I think there was, you could queue up deck building back in, last year or so, but you just couldn't get immediate games or at least compete with it consistently. So um, that was always fun, and then I think just having a team aspect to it really kind of not only fostered the community, but it really gives a different sense of enjoyment and fulfillment when you're playing these games. And it really didn't even feel bad to like lose specific games, because
Oh, my teammates got my back.
yeah, right. Like hey, I made a mistake. I played poorly, and the community is so great, and no matter who you're playing with, they're usually they're not uber competitive to where you feel bad for losing, but it feels like a team effort, both winning and losing, and so you share in the success. You kind of work through the trenches when you lose, and then I feel like you also have this, I think, sense of community where you're like, wow, when you enter competitive scene, you might feel alone, even if you don't do like the league or whatever. But then you meet a couple of people, you kind of make friends with them, you join a team, and then you start to learn from each other, which I think is super beneficial because when you play like a regular tournament, you don't really know, you made a mistake, can't really understand why you made that mistake. You don't really see other perspectives, and it's crazy because you feel like you know the game, but when you play with other people, especially people play at your level, they teach you things, and I'm still learning things about the game that I haven't really considered, and because of the conversation that happens when you play in a team. So I'd say at least for Shibata's tournaments, those are some of my bigger appeals and kind of why I always sign up for those things. Um, I think some of the other tournaments you listed, so Hardy Breeze deck building tournament, the Tournament of Champions. So these all offer something kind of unique, but they're kind of similar in the sense that these are like a pick one faction or you represent one faction and you kind of take it through the tournament. I've always thought that was cool. I do like diversity in my play, but being able to say I am the representative of X faction feels cool, at least to me. And so I feel like the Tournament of Champions is another good one. So this one is a tournament where the community votes who represents what factions. So it's always an honoring thing, kind of like a very just nice gesture to say, oh wow, people believe I am the best at X or Y faction. It it never really even feels like a chore to do it, right? It doesn't feel like, oh no, just another tournament. It's like, wow, people believe that I am the best at this faction, so let me just service them. Let me do my best to prove that. And so feel like every community run tournament always does something slightly different, or they do it in a way that has the community involvement that makes it more than just I'm playing a game, I'm winning or losing, right? It's like, hey, I'm part of a bigger community that's either watching me or competing with me. I think that kind of brings a sense of fulfillment in these games that can kind of feel very lonely at times, because it's a two-player game, right? And so you don't really get a lot of those in two-player games, and so I feel like kind of sense of community really gets me signing up for each and every tournament, even if I know I can't handle it. So
So yeah, I mean, I think that's about time. But you've given us a lot of your time, and we really appreciate having you on and telling us about all High Elves and the tournaments and everything.
no, absolutely. I mean, I love what you guys are doing. I think the very start of the conversation, right? Like when I first heard about the game, instantly fell in love with it. I knew I had stumbled across Magic. It just was unfortunate that there's not a lot of content out there. So I'm always supportive of anyone in the community trying to do more content, put the game out there, and even if it ends up just being just for a small niche community who really loves the game, I feel like that's still great, and happy to do this. Obviously, I feel like I know you guys very well in the community, so thanks for having me on, guys.
Yeah, thanks for coming.
Appreciate you being here. Any place that people can find you or interact with you, or anything you want to shout out?
So I don't really create any sort of content outside of just being, a guest on some of these things. I try to keep it light on my schedule just because I'm pretty busy, but I'm very active on the Discord. So if people want to say hi, or they're interested in hearing a specific thought of mine, or just want to talk, I'm always on the Summoner Wars Discord. So that's probably your best place to find me. So don't be shy. Feel free to say hi.
Or if you make the next base deck tournament finals, Prophet's sure to be there. So
Yeah, well that'll what are the odds?
this has been Discard for Magic. We appreciate everybody listening. We'll see you guys in 2 weeks.